MOT will be up in a minute. MOT will be up in a minute.
And it got back. Hey, how's it going, everybody? Right here. I want to welcome you guys for coming on through.
And it got back.
Got some background to go. Hey, how's it going, everybody? Right here. I want to welcome you guys. Well, welcome back here. We are going to go over some things here about the Civil War. These are things that should have been taught in middle school. At the end of the day, we have to break down the actual mis and disinformation that is actually happening within our actual space by a very specific group of people. So without further ado, we're going to go over the actual clip that this is actually based on, and then we're going to go over the actual history. To make sure that we're not taking anybody out of context or anything, we're going to play a minute before, and then we're going to leave this up to a minute after. So without further ado, hold on a second, so that way we can be able to get this stuff started. Hold on. Boom, boom, boom.
Get a tariff on, right? But the thing is, your wages are so high for the car industry, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And to protect them, they have to equalize this. In other words, they have to keep that car or that electric vehicle the same price as one from America. So you're going.
Yep.
America's always have protective tariffs, man. It's not new.
Yep.
What do you think the Civil War was fought about?
Tariffs and taxes.
It was fought over tariffs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the South was paying 75% of the tariffs. And
Yep.
that's what they were pissed about, and they were actually funding the North. So that's what they're pissed about. And they said, we're not going to pay that shit. And Lincoln said, oh, yes, you will. I'm going to send troops down to collect my taxes. So that's how they fired on South Carolina.
Yep.
Okay, so before we go forward, a simple Google search. Before we go forward, simple Google search. Why did South Carolina fire on Fort Sumter? A simple Google search. A simple Google search. Hold on a second. A simple Google search would even give you an answer to that question. Not even that hard. But without further ado, well, my guest here, Nagone 11. What's going on, Nagone?
Hey, MOT. How you doing?
All
Hey,
right, doing all right, man.
thanks for inviting me up. Yeah, I just this has been an issue that's going on, and I would say not just from one person here in any manosphere, but this has been information that has been put out erroneously for quite a while by quite a few different people, and it has really seeped into the American public post Civil War up to this very day, pushed for um, for for some different reasons, and the reasons are certainly not about us. It's really to try to clean up the South, to try to make them look like they were honorable, try to make it look like this whole conflict was over something other than what it really was really all about, and that was the enslavement of Afro-American peoples here in this country, to serve a group, yes, to economically, of course, benefit those through free labor, but also to be enslaved because that was your lot in life, and you were looked upon as inferior to the white race, and the whole idea of white supremacy really was totally built on that. And that is true up to this very day, and we're dealing with that. So a lot of was what was obfuscated was the fact that slavery was the main issue, and they tried to remake a certain level of history to make that seem as though it was not the primary reason, and other reasons that came about to explain what the war was about that were not true. So that's when we kind of get into what I'd like to call literally the lost cause. And the lost cause was really a pseudo. It's an American pseudo historical and historical negationist myth that claims that the Confederate States during the Civil War, it was just, it was heroic, and not centered on slavery. And this was, of course, first really enunciated very early on, after the war in the 1860s. And it's really kind of helped to influence racism, gender roles, many religious attitudes in the southern states up to this very day. And, the historians who really are on top of this, they've dismantled just almost all of this lost cause mythos. But that's where a lot of this actually begins to really um, emanate from. And that emanation really is about the Southern Confederates putting a spin on the South and speaking about their way of life and their culture and so forth as being the key part, and all these other issues that influenced or caused the war was about the North coming in and taking over and trying to run their society and all of this, and slavery was really not the main part of it. And so you hear such lies as um, taxes and tariffs. You hear, it was about states' rights and these things, which states' rights and so forth was your right to do what? To own slaves. Um, Tariffs and taxes were not even a major part of what the conflict was even about. Because as we get into this a little bit more and we start to look at some of the main pieces that uh, that MOT has just put up, we'll talk a little bit more about why this really came about and what this lie really, really connotes. When we look at the truth of the matter and we start to look into the letters of secession that the southern states that were in the Confederacy that were that ultimately seceded from the Union and looked to move forward to bring their sword against the United States. When we look at South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, when we start to get into these southern states that seceded, we start to look at their letters that state why they did. And when we look at the richest state in the Union at the time, which was Mississippi, and
And the
Mississippi,
president of the presidency.
that's, that's exactly correct. And we look at the Declaration of Immediate Causes, which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union. I will read a quick, brief part of this, which states it outright. This is not anything that
Yes.
one has to, conjecture upon or believe that they have to, somehow intuit. But this is what they said. And it says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world. And a blow to slavery is a blow to commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. Now, this is one of the clearest cases, and it says right here, one of the clearest examples of the Southern state directly stating the connection between slavery and secession. The section also highlights the importance of cotton, and the Southern economy, and the racism evident in the statement that African American slaves were the only ones physically suited to do labor in that climate needed for cultivation of this crop. Mississippi also states its danger of abolition here. So here we go. We look at the richest state in the certainly in the South in the Union of that time, not talking about taxes whatsoever, but really looking at its key grievance of the North, ending this institution, getting rid of it, and getting rid of its black slaves, who were um, almost God's right to be slaves here, and for them to actually control you and make you a slave, and of course, benefit from that free labor.
And
Um,
if it wasn't clear, later on in this secession document from Mississippi, they said it even more plainly. We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species of property. They wanted that $4 billion for those slaves. And if they weren't going to get it, they was just going to leave the union.
they weren't going to get that. It
Hell no,
wasn't
they
even
weren't going to get
it wasn't even a part of it. It was moved out, and they were looked literally to say, we're not trying to do that, because what Lincoln did was ultimately try to work a deal with them to keep them in the Union, give them an opportunity to stay and keep their slaves for a while until they were going to be abolished. And they didn't want to have that either. So they weren't dealing with any type of deal whatsoever. And one thing I wanted to say quickly about President Lincoln was he was no great lover of black people at all.
Oh no.
He,
Oh
he,
no.
he did not love you. And quite frankly, he didn't really want you around. In fact, they were trying to find other types of avenues to remove African Americans from the American continent and move them to Liberia and Africa and these other places to kind of get you out and move you more towards the Caribbean and so forth. They wanted you, if they couldn't have you here as slave, they really wanted you out. So Lincoln really was trying to find a way to get you out of here. But we can get into that a little bit later on. But Lincoln was not your classic friend. Why Lincoln ultimately had to really embrace you at the end was because of the Civil War and the 200,000 of us and over who fought in that conflict to actually help to give where we were literally a decisive factor in that war. Our participation in that war was decisive, and that is what ultimately turned the tide of the battles and gave North its victory. There are other historians who might say, listen, the North fought. Shelby Foote, who was a white historian who was quite excellent. He was on Ken Burns' The Civil War, which is probably one of the greatest documentaries done on this. But talked about how the North had really had one arm behind its back, and if it really had to, really destroy the South, it could have just taken the other arm out, because he spoke of how many colleges and that were in the North that were having regatta races, and men that were just kind of hanging out and going to school and so forth that weren't even involved in this conflict at all. If they put those people actually into service, would have totally eliminated the South. But black soldiers were key in this, and that's kind of the only thing that really kind of turned the president around, because he had to win. So anyway, that's very key, and I'm glad that you put that up. But that
All right.
is,
So
go ahead.
so let me drop this in the chat since people want to probably look at it themselves. You can look at the secession documents for all of those states that actually seceded and the actual order that they actually did. We're going to drop that link right here. So that way, if the actual individual who made the statement about tariffs and taxes, if he can actually do a live stream himself addressing his actual links that he actually have that actually says that. But what we're going to do is put the actual secession documents in the actual chat here, so that way you can see each of the actual states, and the parts are in yellow are the ones to where they specifically are talking about slaveholding or how much of a burden that they were going to be when they could not have this free labor within that area, and how much it was
Very,
going to burden them, not the people that they were actually doing it against. They didn't care about those people, but they were talking about how they were going to be affected by it overall.
very good, very good. That really does speak a great deal to the truth. What I would like to do is, there's actually an author who I tend to like a great deal, Dr. Mark William Phelan. And I don't know, MOT, if you want to possibly put that up as well. Debunking the Civil War Tariff Myth. That really I just kind of want to read down, because I totally believe is how he handled some of this was so effective, and really debunks this myth. So I really want to kind of get to the meat and potatoes of this really early, because we can get into a lot. We can get more into the lost cause, of which really pushes forward this narrative. And remember, this narrative has been pushed forth by the Confederates. They pushed that
Yes.
narrative forward. The Confederates pushed that forward. So they pushed the taxation issue and so forth. But when you look at the Southern Convention of the secessionists, while they were forming their state, what was the major issue in that convention that they had, of which, of course, they had Jefferson Davis as who became president of that union. And when they spoke in detail about what was going on, they did not talk about taxes whatsoever. Taxes, in fact, were, if anything, an ancillary aspect of what was going on. The major issue was slavery, the slaveholding states, and how they could expand it further beyond the West, of which literally held them in check by the agreements of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but of which we can look at a little bit. But that's what they were trying to expand upon, and said, no, we really want to expand slavery. Now, one of the things I'm going to put in and interject here very quickly, and for any people out here who have a Haitian ancestry or background, a real hat has to be tipped to the Haitians, because what really signaled the death knell of slavery in the Western world was the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804, which was fought over that time, where the French actually lost. In that tremendous conflict that those African revolutionaries fought in that period and beat the French. We saw out of that, United States got gains from it because the Louisiana Purchase came from that. Very few people really make the connection between the Louisiana Purchase and the Haitian Revolution of that time, where the Louisiana Purchase, which added 30% land mass to the United States for $5 million, was sold. Okay, President Jefferson in here, that deal was cut because of our brothers in Haiti who fought against slavery and was able to beat the French, and Napoleon, with his far-flung enterprise and his wars and so forth, could not handle what he was doing. He was short of cash, and so he was willing to sell that. And so that landmass came into these United States, which was very significant, because from that Louisiana Purchase, we had Louisiana and so forth. In those lands, they were still blacks who had come over, and the fingers and the hands and the influence of that Haitian Revolution played a very key role in bringing down slavery here, of which is never connected. And literal agents from Haiti played a role in one of the biggest slave revolts we had here in this country of 1831 and 2 of Nat Turner and so forth. And they were actually some Haitian revolutionaries who were part of that conflict. Many people are not aware of that, and many of the other conflicts that had gone on. So this was all about slavery. It was all about reducing. There was nothing here about taxes. That was
So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this. Going to watch this video on the true cause of the American Civil War. They're going to address the lost cause actual myth, and you're going to actually see that it had nothing to do with tariffs or taxes, which there was no real reason to even bring that up.
that is actually correct. So
between 1860 and 1861, 11 Southern states withdrew from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. They left or seceded in response to the growing movement for the nationwide abolition of slavery. Mississippi said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." South Carolina cited hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. In March 1861, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, proclaimed that the cornerstone of the new Confederate government was white supremacy, or as he put it, slavery and subordination to white people was the natural and normal condition of Black people in America and the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. 3 weeks after the now infamous Cornerstone speech, the American Civil War began. The conflict lasted 4 years, had a death toll of about 750,000, and ended with the Confederacy's defeat. By 1866, barely a year after the war ended, Southern sources began claiming the conflict wasn't actually about slavery. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist and formerly enslaved person, cautioned, "The spirit of secession is stronger today than ever." From the words of Confederate leaders, the reason for the war could not have been clearer. It was slavery. So how did this revisionist history come about? The answer lies in the lost cause, a cultural myth about the Confederacy. The term was coined by Edward Pollard, a pro-Confederate journalist. In 1866, he published The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. Pollard pointed out that the U.S. Constitution gave states the right to govern themselves independently in all areas except those explicitly designated to the national government. According to him, the Confederacy wasn't defending slavery. It was defending each state's right to choose whether or not to allow slavery. This explanation effectively turned white Southerners' documented defense of slavery and white supremacy into a patriotic defense of the Constitution. The Civil War had devastated the country, leaving those who had supported the Confederacy grasping to justify their actions. Many pro-Confederate writers, political leaders, and others were quick to adopt and spread the narrative of the lost cause. One organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, played a key role in transmitting the ideas of the lost cause to future generations. Founded in Nashville, Tennessee in 1894, the UDC united thousands of middle and upper-class white Southern women. The UDC raised thousands of dollars to build monuments to Confederate soldiers. These were often unveiled with large public ceremonies and given prominent placements, especially on courthouse lawns. The Daughters also placed Confederate portraits in public schools. They monitored textbooks to minimize the horrors of slavery and its significance in the Civil War, passing revisionist history and racist ideology down through generations. By 1918, the UDC claimed over 100,000 members. As their numbers grew, they increased their influence outside the South. Presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson both met with UDC members and enabled them to memorialize the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery. The UDC still exists and defends Confederate symbols as part of a noble heritage of sacrifice by their ancestors. Despite the wealth of primary sources showing that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War, the myth about states' rights persists today. In the aftermath of the war, Frederick Douglass and his abolitionist contemporaries feared this erasure of slavery from the history of the Civil War could contribute to the government's failure to protect the rights of Black Americans, a fear that has repeatedly been proven valid. In an 1871 address at Arlington Cemetery, Douglass said, "We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?" History has a funny way of bolstering those with the power to write it. For example, what would the history of Christopher Columbus look like if it was written by a Native American? Put history to the test with this video.
All right, we just completed that video just to show you that the lost cause is no different than what's happening now, where you see these right-wing people who go in with like a critical race theory or anything else. It's all about misrepresenting history and passing it down to other people. So what they want to do is just misrepresent history in front of people as a means of furthering their own goals of just not teaching history and keeping the same thing going that they're clearly doing right now.
That is 100% accurate. That's a great piece. And that really speaks directly to what is going on today and actually what they're actually trying to push. And when we start to look at things such as CRT and so forth, this is why they're teaching this in schools and so forth. They have fear of anyone learning any more history because this is, remember, CRT is not taught in schools, but why they're trying to reduce African American history is because they don't want the truth of this story really to be told and really well understood. Because with that, they can continue to undermine you here in this country without you having this knowledge or really knowing it. So that's why people who are pushing this narrative are dangerous. They're dangerous because they are actually trying to push a false narrative that isn't true. Now, I wanted to say something very quickly here with Dr. Palin, who happens to be a very learned professor and debunking what he calls the Civil War tariff myth. And he gets into a couple of key areas that he states right here. And I don't know, MOT, if you want to pull it up, but I'll read from this article here very quickly. Now,
Which one?
Dr. Palin is a lecturer of imperial history at the University of Exeter, a research associate at the U.S. Studies Center, University of Sydney. He's also the author of The Great Civil War Lie. That was written on back in June of 2013, and this was published in the New York Times. And he's also written a book called The Civil War's Forgotten Transatlantic Tariff Debate and the Confederacy's Free Trade Diplomacy. And that's in the Journal of the Civil War Era. He is a very learned professor. And he starts out to say very quickly here that the outbreak of the American Civil War is now more than 150 years past. All the while, the question of what caused the conflict continues to spark disagreement. This despite a long-standing consensus among specialists that slavery, a cultural, political, ideological, and economic institution that permeated and divided the 19th century in American society, was the primary cause of the war. One of the most egregious of the so-called lost cause narratives instead suggests that it was not slavery, but a protective tariff that sparked the Civil War. Okay, and then he goes on to say, on March 2nd, 1861, which was something that was called the moral tariff, that was signed into law by outgoing Democratic President James Buchanan to protect the northern infant industries. This was a protection for the northern infant industries. Now, something very key here that we need to know, and I'll get into that in a second. But as he gets into it, he says a pernicious lie quickly formed around the tariff's passage, a lie suggesting that somehow this tariff had caused the U.S. Civil War. By ignoring slavery's central role in precipitating secession and Civil War, this tariff myth has survived in the United States for more than a century and a half and needs to be debunked once and for all. And he goes into a nice litany of giving here, of which I'm not going to read all deeply into it, but a very key factor, he says, in debunking this tariff myth, two points quickly illustrate how the tariff issue was far from the cause of the war. Point number one, the tariff issue, on those rare occasions in which it was even mentioned at all, was utterly overwhelmed by the issue of slavery within the South's own secession conventions. And point number two, precisely because the Southern states began seceding from December 1860 onwards, a number of Southern senators had resigned that could otherwise have voted against the tariff bill. Had they not resigned, they would have had enough votes in the Senate to successfully block the tariff's congressional passage. So, in other words, far from causing the Civil War or secession, the moral tariff of March 1861 became law as a result of Southern secession. So this tariff that these guys were trying to say was, said, the Southerners wouldn't have even voted for it. The fact that they seceded left others to vote for this thing that it actually went through. So it would have never even happened if the Southern states were still in the Union. It wouldn't have happened. So that just debunks the whole, tax thing and all of this stuff that these people are really trying to push, which really is just not legitimate. It just isn't legitimate, and it did not play a central role in the war at all. At all. And as we look at and go ahead, MOT, you were going to say something?
No, sir. Go ahead. Keep going.
Okay. And as we look at another one, if you want to pull this one up to the Essential Civil War Curriculum, and this is by Dr. Philip Magnus, Magnus, and Philip Magnus, sharp brother. Philip Magnus, he's actually a. If you want to pull that up, if you want to pull that up very quickly as well, Dr. Philip Magnus.
Which one? The third one?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
And
Okay, I'll pull the third one right now. Hold on.
And it's a long one.
Boom. Present. Share screen.
And he's a historian who focuses on the political economy of slavery and Civil War, and more broadly, the economic history of the United States. He is a co-author of The Colonization After Emancipation, Lincoln, and the Movement for Black Resettlement, along with doctors Sebastian and Page, as well as numerous articles on the colonization movement. His work on the Civil War era has appeared in the Journal of Our Early Republic, the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association and Slavery and Abolition, Journal of the Supreme Court History, and other popular outlets such as the New York Times and Newsweek and the Disunion series. And he currently teaches at the Schar School of Public Policy at George Mason University. Very, very, very sharp individual, very critical. And when we go right down to where, if we can go down to where it says, just quickly here, and these are just, we're not even going to talk about the moral tariff, but the tariff, hold on. I'll pull this up, just give me 1 sec. Here we go. The tariff secession, the tariff and the secession winner. All right. And it says, and in this article that he has written, he goes and he talks about the tariff and secession winter, and he says the tariff's role in the secession crisis was largely analogous to the tossing of another can of gasoline onto a raging slavery-fueled fire. Despite later claims of preeminence in the post-war lost cause literature, the tariff was never more than an ancillary grievance added to the litany of secessionist charges against the incoming Republican Party's positions on slavery in the territories, the weakened federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and the South's rapidly changing position in the United States Senate. But neither was the tariff absent from discussion. So tariffs were discussed, but tariffs were not the center point of this conflict. The center point of this conflict was slavery. So
yes, no one debunks that. I mean, the Army War College don't debunk it. The Smithsonian don't debunk it. The Air Force Academy don't actually debunk it. Like, no one in the military debunks the history of what the Civil War is about. No one. Not a single person. Not a single person that made this tariff or actual taxes, actual things stick. When you bring the military and the actual historians in, nothing is said about any of this stuff. It's always fringe group who's pushing this stuff in mostly conservative areas that kind of turn these things into this for the most part.
That's precisely correct. We've brought up as to why this tariff was actually BS, and and I'm just going to just backtrack. I'm not asking MOT to backtrack on this, but one of the key things that were brought up were why this actually was really propagated. And Dr. Not Dr. Man, just hang on 1 second. I'll tell you here in a second. Why Dr. Palin, why he actually really gets into why this issue was really pushed were by agents of the literally of the Confederacy. And he speaks about how not only did that myth push here, but they had to push it during that time in the mid 19th century to England. And they wanted that pushed into so the English citizens would ultimately give sympathy towards the South, because they understood that if you talked about tariffs and that's when people were getting taxed unfairly, and the president was going to come down there and grab your taxes, that would give them sympathy to the South and say, how dare these people do this, which was ultimately a lie. The British ultimately began to see through that as the war went on. They looked at what happened with the moral tariff, and they understood what the real causes of this was. So it was pro-Southern business interests and journalists who fed the myth that the war was over trade, not slavery, to better win over the people who might be appalled at siding with at siding with slave owners against the forces of abolition. On March 12th, 1861, just 10 days after the moral tariff had become law, the London Times gave an editorial voice to the tariff lie. The newspapers pronounced that protection was quite as much a cause of the disruption of the Union as slavery, and remarked upon how the moral tariff had much changed the tone of public feeling in favor of the secessionists. So they were running they were running a misinformation game back then to try to gain popular support for their movement, and that's what this was. This was done by Southern agents. So that's why England at that time that really was perpetuating this lie as well, because the South actually wanted England to come in and join with them. They were trying to really gain public support, and that did not really come off well after the war started to go on. And this was actually seen through. They actually were able to see through this. But that's some of the key things that we have to really understand about this tariff lie and what this is about, and why this tariff lie is actually significant today, because we have those who are trying to push this myth today to actually gain favor, make the South look very favorable, play it politically, so people like President Trump and them can go into the South and say, these monuments are really about these wonderful, Americans who fought for freedom and so forth, and really don't want to talk about what this thing was really about. And it was about a vicious, savage war of slavery. And that's what this was fought over. And it only ended by a vicious, savage war that that stopped it. Anyway, MOT.
Yep, killed a lot of people, and a lot of and most of the country, like Mississippi, has never recovered from that. Ever recovered from that. Ever recovered from that. And a lot
That
of people don't
is
understand is that the people who are pushing these things, they're always conservatives living in liberal areas and conservative ran states, or conservatives living in liberal areas and very large liberal states. The actual people who push this actual stuff, they never live in the actual small town rural America that they purport to actually represent. They never live there. Period.
absolutely true. And that is exactly correct. MOT brings up an excellent point that we all know. The southern states, many of them, as we know today, are welfare states of America in so many ways. When we talk about that, their state budgets are 30, some are close to 40% underwritten by the federal government. Um, and yet, the people get some of the worst outcomes, who are getting the worst outcomes in these states, are ones who are taking the majority of the federal dollar and are rejecting certain things. And we see what's going on, which is really rather obscene. But Mississippi went from the wealthiest state in the Union to the poorest after the war. And what was their commerce? Slavery. So it was over slavery. It wasn't over tax. It was over slavery. And when we look at well, they were border states. But when we look at other states such as Tennessee, Alabama, and these others, these are poor states. That
Louisiana and Arkansas, yeah, they
Louisiana,
all fell for the same thing.
exactly.
Same reason.
Louisiana is, I think, next to the poorest state in the union currently today. Louisiana, with all their
Yeah.
natural resources and so forth, still a extremely poor state because of
And
what
all
they.
those ports that they don't use to the level of effectiveness. So is Mississippi. Like those ports was being used better in the 1400s than it is right now.
That is correct.
Were
That is
better used
that
in
is
the
accurate.
1400s than they are now. In the
That,
1600s than they are now.
that is correct.
Better used. Isn't that crazy?
That is correct.
They
That is
were
correct.
better put to better use back then than they are now. And a lot of people here just don't understand that you may not believe in this actual stuff, but the people who actually do show up, they're fighting for something. And when you don't show up as a counter narrative to what they're actually doing, then you just cede the actual victory to them for actually no reason because you don't agree with these people on anything. I guarantee you that.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to give voice to that because the people who are pushing this are really way out there, and any black man who is an Afro American, you have to ask the question: why would they push this narrative? To what benefit does that? Why would they push this narrative? And just not people in this space are doing that, but in other areas as well. And you have to ask yourself, what are you thinking, and why don't you understand what this history is? We could stay here all night and really get even deeper into this, but I just wanted to put that out there. And if anybody feels as though that they can debunk this, then I would like to see them try. And you have other lies such as, oh, it was the Trans-Western Railroad. They went to war because of the railroads. And, you hear all of this madness that really tries to circumvent this issue of slavery. And we look at these states today that were very wealthy then, that are not wealthy today, not just because of the war, because of what was their main business. They have not replaced slavery as their main business to this
All
very
because
day.
they couldn't simply profit share.
Exactly
Think
correct.
about how stupid that is. You gave away the most power in the union because you simply wouldn't profit share. You know how stupid that is? How much power you gave up, how much land you gave up because you simply couldn't profit share. And you misused Christianity to keep hold of people that you shouldn't be having control over in the first place. Unbelievable. I
And
still don't believe it today. Like just simply treating those workers like human beings. You had the land. You clearly could have built housing for them. What is the actual use? Like, listen, if they would have allowed full counting of those personnel, the Southern United States would be running the government right now
well,
with the
I would also,
Electoral College. They would be running it. They would be running it.
and see, they stayed as a majority agrarian type of society. They did not really move heavily towards the industrialized North
Industrialized, yeah, later on.
as things were really changing. They didn't really push that, and they would, were kind of running a much more, like you said, agrarian development. So what happened was the very wealthy of those states who stayed wealthy then, who are wealthy today, um, they kept making the goods,
Uh-huh.
the raw materials, shipping it up to the North producing in the North processing those into other types of products and moving it out to the rest of the world, if you will. So there was, once the South had to get in line, and once they got in line, they got in their line on the production line, and so they came up with the raw materials, and then the North processed everything and produced the goods out of there, and then shipped everything else out. And that was the end of, and that was pretty much the end of it. And that's what we've seen since. That's what we've seen since. And we see people in the South right now who literally get around some of these industries, get poisoned, sick, and torn out the frame. They don't
Yes.
care. These small businesses, and they keep pushing out their product, and the other people suffer, but yet they want to sit down and say you're the problem from that. And that those are holdovers from that kind of slave mentality from those days. So it still hurts many people to this very day in the South. And as MOT correctly said, they never recovered. They never recovered from that. They have not recovered.
Yeah, we got Dr. Lawrence guy in the house. Like you said, other black people push the narrative, the tariff narrative, because they're plants, agents, sell out, take your pick. It's all the same. I agree.
He's absolutely correct about that. He's absolutely correct about that.
While
And
they
that's
don't live in the South, by the way, they push that narrative outside the South. Because they don't push that narrative in the South. You'll get walked up on.
you might get stole
You
on,
will
as they
get
say.
walked up on. Yeah. You will. I mean,
So,
they push that stuff from them ivory towers in those liberal states, being a conservative behind tight security. They know full well they're not coming down to the South pushing that type of narrative. No one is,
so
for the most part.
so we have that saying. So you have people pushing these false narratives that taxes were the issue. We see that, and at the Southern Secessionist conventions, this was not a issue. Taxes were not an
No.
issue. It was slavery. The letters of secession were about slavery and white
Oh,
supremacy
yeah.
and about white supremacy. That's what this was about. It was their way of life. You were supposed to be a slave underneath that system. You were not supposed to be an equal citizen. And they've been pushing that narrative ever since. And that's where we really are at this stage. I just want to do a quick thumbnail sketch. Want to get people kind of brought up to speed and debunk this lie once and for all. Just debunk it. It's a lie, and
And
there's
here's the
no one
thing:
who, and there's no
another
one who can take it.
unforced error. It's another unforced error. He clearly
Well,
could have stayed on tariffs that he was actually correct about, by the way. He did not have to pull in the actual idea about the Civil War. Unneeded, unforced error.
but remember that is pushed by a certain segment in this country called those who support the lost cause. That's the lost cause narrative that once again speaks about how the South was noble and clean and excellent, and it was about their way of life and their culture, and not and other issues other than slavery as to why this war was fought. It was a way to once again put a different spin on the game, to put themselves in a more favorable light. Why would a black man who was enslaved, viciously enslaved under this system, look to support that narrative? You have to ask yourself that question.
No, not at all. And no one's from the South. No matter how how conservative you think you are, there ain't nobody from the South who's pushing this. These people come from these Cato Institutes, these Brookings Institutes, these Heritage Institute type people. They branch off, they go into these highly liberalized areas and they push this actual nonsense behind a lot of money, and it just gets fueled in mostly southern states. But at the end of the day, these people are not actually in those areas pushing these things in our area. Well, outside of Florida. I will give Florida credit. They are a right wing controlled state, and he's pushing that stuff there hardcore. But when you get the actual eyes on Florida, nobody wants that guy's president. Period. Once they
No.
see what that dude's up to. So before we get up out of here, it is great to go over the actual beam footage that led us here in the first place. So that way you can't claim that we were just making stuff up. So why don't we do this? We're going to stop this. We're going to present this, and we're going to actually go back to the actual footage. And I play for a minute before, and it's going to be a couple of seconds afterwards, so that way you can understand what the conversation is about. So we're going to do that again, so that way you can claim that we're not making shit up. I do agree. It will be a better argument for the American Revolution, a far better argument for the American Revolution, exclusively, because that was a real issue than the American Revolution. But then again, it still falls flat at the end of the day. You are right about that, Dr. Lawrence Guy.
It does.
Yes. Those are for Texas textbooks, Rael. They do actually say that. Because my niece, who actually lives in Texas, I picked up their actual history book, and it does say exactly that stupid shit in the book about people were migrant workers. It's crazy.
You get a
And
tariff
and,
on, right? Thing
and that
is, your wages are so high for the car industry, right? Okay,
Yeah.
and to protect them, they have to equalize this. In other words, they have to keep that car or that electric vehicle the same price as one from America. So
Yep.
America's always have protective tariffs, man. It's not new.
Yeah.
What do you think the
And
Civil War was fought about?
tariffs and taxes.
It was fought over tariffs, right?
Hmm.
Because the South was paying 75% of the tariffs, and
Yep.
that's what they were pissed about. And they were actually funding the North. So that's what they're pissed about. And they said, we're not going to pay that shit. And Lincoln said, oh, yes, you will. I'm going to send troops down to collect my taxes. And so that's how they fired on South Carolina.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, the go. Anyway, so is
there
there
you go.
anything else you want to discuss before we get up out of here?
No, I think I think we made our point. You can see, people are taking, just the wrong path on that, and it's time to really turn the corners on this stuff and really start to put this stuff to bed, because it doesn't, under scrutiny as we see, it does not hold water. But anyway, we're not calling anybody any names, anything of that nature, nothing of the sort. We're looking at the facts. We're sticking to that, and that's what I'm going to be adhering to on a regular and consistent basis. MOT, thank you very much for inviting me up.
And I want to thank Lawrence Guy for stopping through this Productive Men's actual live stream. Here we're going in a different direction while everybody else is still stuck on the relationship conversation. These are conversations that need to be had, because once you have information congealment, you can actually make actual progress and be a part of the process within your local area. Because it means nothing to talk about these things if you're not going to put these things into actions within your own local area. It means nothing if you're not going to participate. You can talk about all these things that you want to, but at the end of the day, there is a policy that puts this stuff in place. And if the only thing you want to do is go to these spread apathy streams and start complaining about women that you don't have access to, and that's your level of participation, then it's clear that these people don't belong within our space. And I am the heart and soul of the actual Black Manosphere. I am the president of it. I want to be responsible for the content that I do, and the actual company that I keep, and the individuals who I'm around, and the content that I actually do. That's what leadership is about. It's not about bringing a whole bunch of people with you who don't belong here. So at the end of the day, I want to thank you guys coming through. I'm the man tomorrow. You guys have a really nice rest of y'all night. Make sure you like the video on the way out. You guys have a really nice night. Peace.